I never thought a piece of paper could feel like a weapon. But the day I unrolled that property map on my kitchen table, I understood exactly why people fight so hard over lines nobody can see. Lines drawn 100 years ago by a surveyor with a compass and a notebook. Lines that most of us never think about until someone tries to move them without asking. My name is Daniel Whitfield, and for 6 years I lived in a quiet subdivision called Cedar Hollow, in a house I loved on a lot I thought I understood completely. This is the story of how a homeowners association decided a strip of my backyard belonged to them, how they built a fence across it without so much as a knock on my door, and how one dusty document from the county archive turned the entire situation upside down. It is a story about property, about power, and about if you've ever dealt with an overreaching HOA, you already know how this feels in your stomach before I even finish telling you. So let's get it. The house I thought I knew. I bought my home in Cedar Hollow back when the market was calmer than it is now. It was a modest 3-bedroom on just under half an acre, backing up to a stretch of trees that separated my yard from a small retention pond the community used for drainage. When I signed the closing papers, my real estate agent walked me through the survey. She pointed at the boundary lines, showed me where my property ended and where the association's common area began, and I nodded along the way most people do, trusting that for years, that boundary never mattered. I planted a small vegetable garden near the back fence line. I put up a modest shed for my tools. My daughter set up a swing between 2 oak trees that, according to the original survey, stood well within my own property. Nobody from the HOA ever said a word. There were no complaints, no notices, nothing. Life went on the way it does in a peaceful neighborhood, with block parties in the summer and quiet evenings the rest of the year. Then, 3 years ago, the HOA elected a new board. And that's when everything started to shift. The new HOA president, a man named Russell Kane, moved into the neighborhood about a year before he took over the board. He was the kind of person who introduced himself by mentioning his previous job in property management, as if that alone gave him some special authority over how the rest of us lived. At first, his enthusiasm seemed harmless. He wanted new landscaping at the entrance. He wanted a stricter policy on trash cans being visible from the street. Small things. Annoying, but small. It wasn't until the board started talking about the retention pond area that things became personal. The first warning. It began with a letter. Official HOA letterhead, formal language, the kind of tone that tries to sound like law even when it isn't. The letter stated that the association was planning to install a perimeter fence around the retention pond for safety and liability reasons, and that some homeowners whose properties bordered the common area would see a small section of fencing along their back property line. I remember reading it twice, because something about the wording felt off. It didn't specify where exactly the fence would go. It didn't include a diagram. It simply said homeowners would be notified before construction began. I wasn't particularly worried. I assumed the fence would run along the actual boundary between my land and the common area, the same line marked on my original survey. I even thought it might be a nice addition, since our old dog had a habit of wandering toward the pond when the gate was left open. I want to be honest with you. I didn't call the HOA to ask for the fence plans. I didn't request a copy of the site drawing. In hindsight, that was a mistake, though not one I could have predicted would matter so much. Most people don't interrogate their HOA over a routine maintenance letter. Most people trust that the association, which is supposed to represent, I was wrong to trust that. The fence appears. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, I left for work like any other day. When I came home that evening, there was a construction crew parked at the end of my street, and as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was a brand new chain-link fence running straight through my backyard. Not along the tree line where the common area began. Not near the pond. It cut directly across my lawn, roughly 20 feet in front of where my property actually ended, according to everything I understood about my lot. My garden was now on the common area side of the fence. My shed sat awkwardly close to the new fence line, practically touching it. The swing my daughter used was gone, the 2 oak trees now standing behind the barrier, no longer accessible from my own yard. I stood there for a long moment simply staring, trying to convince myself I was misreading the layout. Then I walked the length of the fence, and my disbelief turned into something closer to anger. This wasn't a boundary fence installed with any thought for where my property actually ended. This was a wall. I called the HOA management office immediately. No answer. I called Russell Kane directly, since his number was listed in the community directory for board inquiries. He picked up on the fourth ring, sounding entirely unbothered. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, "I take it you saw the new fence." "I saw a fence built through the middle of my backyard," I said. "That's not what your letter described." He explained, in a tone that suggested he had rehearsed this exact conversation, that the board had consulted an updated survey that showed the retention pond's buffer zone extended further into several backyards than originally believed. He said the fence was placed according to that updated survey, for consistency and safety compliance, and that homeowners affected would simply need to adjust. Adjust to what? I asked. "You took 20 feet of my yard." "The board's position is that this area was always intended to be part of the common space," he said. "Your original survey may not reflect updated flood zone requirements." I asked to see this updated survey. He said it would be shared at the appropriate time, once the board finalized the paperwork with the county. That answer told me everything I needed to know. There was no updated survey. Or if there was one, it hadn't been shared with anyone, and I had a strong suspicion I knew why. Digging into the records. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier, scrolling through old emails, trying to find the digital copy of my original property survey from the day I closed on the house. I found it eventually, a scanned PDF buried in a folder from my mortgage lender. The boundary lines were clear. My property extended well past where the new fence now stood. The 2 oak trees, my garden, even part of the shed's foundation, all of it sat comfortably inside my own lot according to that survey. The next morning, I decided this wasn't something I could resolve with phone calls alone. I drove to the county recorder's office, the place where property records, plats, and deeds are stored for anyone to review. I wanted to see the original subdivision plat, the master document that laid out every lot in Cedar Hollow when the neighborhood was first developed, along with any amendments that might have been filed since. The clerk who helped me was patient and thorough. She pulled the original plat map from the 1980s, along with a folder of amendments filed over the decades. We spread the documents across a long table, and there it was in black and white ink, faded but perfectly legible. Lot 14, my lot, extended in a clean rectangular shape all the way to a marked boundary line roughly 5 feet behind where my shed stood. The common area, labeled clearly as drainage and retention easement, HOA maintained. There was no amendment on file adjusting that boundary. No resurvey. No file change of any kind since the original plat was recorded. According to the county's own records, the HOA's brand new fence sat roughly 15 feet inside my private property, on land that had always belonged to me and nobody else. I asked the clerk to make copies of everything. She did, and she mentioned something in passing that stuck with me. She said HOAs occasionally try to claim buffer zones or setback areas as common space, especially near ponds or shared amenities, because homeowners rarely check the county plat before accepting whatever the board tells them. It happens more often than people realize, she said, usually with nobody noticing until a fence goes up or a tree gets cut down. I left that office with a folder of documents and a very different kind of determination than I had walked in with. Driving home, I kept replaying the conversation with the clerk in my head. She hadn't seemed surprised by what we found. She'd seen this pattern before, she said, more times than she could count. Homeowners associations sometimes operate with a strange kind of confidence, as though the authority to maintain a neighborhood's common spaces also grants the authority to redefine where those spaces begin and end. It rarely happens out of outright malice, she told me. More often it happens because nobody checks. A board makes a decision, nobody questions the paperwork behind it, and the decision simply becomes reality because no one pushed back hard enough to reveal otherwise. That night, I sat down with my wife and walked her through everything I'd found. She'd been just as stunned as I was when the fence first went up, but now, looking at the plat map spread across our table, she asked the question that would end up shaping everything that came next. If the HOA was willing to move a boundary line without any real authority to do so, what else might they have quietly changed over the years without anyone noticing? It was a fair question, and one I didn't have an answer to yet. But it was the question that pushed me from simply wanting my fence removed to wanting the full truth about how this had happened in the first place. The HOA digs in. Armed with copies of the original plat, I requested a formal meeting with the HOA board. I expected some embarrassment, maybe an apology, perhaps a quick agreement to move the fence back to where it belonged. Instead, I got a room full of defensiveness. Russell Kane sat at the head of the table with 2 other board members flanking him. When I laid the county plat map in front of them and pointed to the clear boundary line, he barely glanced at it. "This is an older document," he said. "The board relied on a licensed surveyor's assessment when planning the fence." "Then show me that survey," I said, "because the county has no record of any updated boundary for my lot." He shuffled some papers, then said the survey was still being formalized and would be available once the surveyor completed his final report. I asked for the surveyor's name and license number so I could verify it independently. He said he would look into providing that. It was the kind of answer people give when they're stalling, not when they have nothing to hide. One of the other board members, a woman named Patricia, seemed uncomfortable throughout the meeting. She didn't say much, but I noticed she avoided eye contact whenever Russell spoke about the survey. I made a mental note of that. The meeting ended without resolution. The board's official position was that the fence would remain in place while they reviewed the matter further. I left feeling like I had walked into a wall built not of chain link, but of bureaucratic stubbornness. Escalation. Over the following weeks, things got worse before they got better. I received a formal violation notice from the HOA claiming that my garden bed, my shed, and a section of my irrigation system were now encroaching on common area property and needed to be removed within 30 days or the association would pursue further action, which included the possibility of fines and even a lien against my home. Let that sink in. The HOA built a fence through my private backyard, then sent me a violation notice for having structures on land that had always been mine, structures I had every legal right to build in the first place. I contacted a real estate attorney that same week. Her name was Melissa Okafor, and after reviewing the county plat, my original survey, and the HOA's violation letter, she was blunt about the situation. In her professional opinion, the HOA had no documented authority to alter the property boundary and had likely trespassed by constructing a fence on privately owned land. She recommended I hire an independent, licensed surveyor to conduct a fresh boundary survey of my property, one that would hold up in court if this escalated further. I agreed immediately. Within 2 weeks, a surveyor named Thomas Reyes came out with his equipment, spent an entire afternoon walking the property, and confirmed what the county plat had already suggested. My property line extended past the new fence by exactly 15 feet and 4 inches. He staked the actual boundary with small orange flags, and standing there looking at those flags planted well beyond the HOA's fence line, I felt something between vindication and quiet fury. The community starts talking. Word travels fast in a small neighborhood, especially when there's a dispute involving an HOA board people already had mixed feelings about. Once my neighbors heard I had hired a surveyor and consulted an attorney, a few of them reached out privately. One neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Carol who lived 2 houses down, told me she had noticed something odd when the fence was installed. She mentioned that the construction crew had also cleared a section of trees near the pond that seemed to line up suspiciously close to Russell Kane's own backyard, on the opposite side of the community. She wasn't sure what to make of it, but she thought I should know. That comment lit a spark in my mind. If the HOA was willing to redraw one boundary line without documentation, was it possible other boundaries had been quietly adjusted as well? I began asking around, carefully, without making accusations, simply gathering information the way you might piece together a puzzle one conversation at a time. It turned out I wasn't the only homeowner who had noticed unusual changes near the common areas. Another neighbor mentioned that a section of the community walking trail had been rerouted the previous year, conveniently avoiding a wooded area behind Russell's property that, according to rumor, he had begun using as an extended part of his own yard, complete with a small fire pit and a storage shed that nobody remembered seeing approved by the architectural committee. I want to be careful here, because at this point everything was speculation, second-hand comments, and neighborhood whispers rather than hard evidence. But it planted a question in my mind that I couldn't ignore. What if the fence across my backyard wasn't really about safety or drainage compliance at all? What if it was part of a broader pattern, one where the person overseeing the association's common land had quietly expanded his own footprint at everyone else's expense, using vague language about surveys and safety to justify it? I started keeping a small notebook, jotting down every detail neighbors shared with me, along with dates and names whenever I could get them. It felt strange at first, almost like I was building a case rather than just trying to get my backyard back. But Melissa had warned me that if this ever escalated into a legal dispute, patterns mattered. A single questionable fence might be explained away as an honest mistake. A pattern of boundary changes that consistently seemed to benefit one particular person was much harder to dismiss. A few neighbors were hesitant to say much at all, worried about drawing the board's attention or facing retaliation through selective enforcement of unrelated HOA rules, something that apparently had happened to a homeowner a few years back who publicly questioned a landscaping contract. That alone told me something about the culture the current leadership had cultivated. People were afraid to ask basic questions about how shared community decisions were being made, and that fear was exactly what had allowed small, unchecked changes to accumulate over time without anyone connecting the dots. Requesting the full records. With Melissa's guidance, I submitted a formal records request to the HOA, something most associations are legally required to honor within a reasonable timeframe. I asked for every survey, boundary assessment, and site plan the board had used to justify the new fence, along with any records related to modifications near the retention pond and walking trail over the past 3 years. The HOA stalled for weeks, offering excuses about administrative backlog and staff turnover. Melissa sent a formal letter reminding the board of their legal obligation to produce these records, and reminding them that continued delay could be used as evidence of bad faith if the matter proceeded to litigation. Eventually, the documents arrived, delivered almost begrudgingly in a thin folder that felt deliberately incomplete. There was no updated survey for my lot. There was, however, a site plan for trail improvements from the previous year, and buried within it was a small hand-drawn adjustment showing the trail rerouted around a section labeled simply as private use area, with no explanation of who designated it that way or under what authority. That phrase, private use area, on land that belonged to the entire community, was the thread that started unraveling everything. The property map that changed everything. Melissa suggested we go a step further and request the master property map for the entire retention pond and common area parcel from the county's GIS mapping department, the geographic information system that maintains precise, legally binding property boundaries for the whole county. Unlike the aging paper plat, this digital map used modern surveying data cross-referenced with satellite imagery and recorded deeds. When the map came through, Thomas the surveyor helped us interpret it properly, overlaying the HOA's common area boundary against every individual lot line in the subdivision, including mine and, notably, including Russell Kane's. What we found was almost too fitting to be believable, the kind of twist you'd expect in a story rather than real life, except this time it was sitting right there in an official county database. My property boundary matched exactly what the original plat and Thomas's independent survey had already shown. The fence sat well within land that was legally, unquestionably mine. But the map also revealed something else entirely. The wooded section behind Russell Kane's house, the area with the fire pit and the unauthorized shed that neighbors had mentioned, along with a portion of the rerouted walking trail, was not part of the HOA's common area at all. According to the county's official parcel data, that section of land belonged to an entirely separate, undeveloped parcel, one that had never been transferred to the HOA when the subdivision was originally platted. It was still owned by the original development company from decades earlier, a company that had long since dissolved, leaving the parcel in a strange kind of legal limbo, technically unclaimed and unmaintained by anyone, including the HOA. In simpler terms, Russell Kane had spent years quietly expanding his personal use of land that belonged to nobody currently active, land the HOA had no legitimate authority over either. And in an effort to justify that expansion and avoid scrutiny, someone on the board appeared to have shifted attention elsewhere, redrawing common area boundaries into homeowners' actual private lots, including mine, likely to make the numbers on paper seem to balance out, or perhaps simply because it was easier to encroach on a quiet homeowner than to explain why the association's own leadership had been using land they didn't own. I won't pretend I fully understood every legal nuance in that moment, but Melissa's reaction told me enough. She read through the parcel data twice, then looked up at me and said this was no longer just a boundary dispute. This was a documented pattern of an HOA official misusing land, misrepresenting property boundaries to homeowners, and potentially violating the association's own governing documents regarding common area use. Bringing it to the board. We requested another meeting, this time with the full board present, along with the HOA's legal counsel, since Melissa insisted on formal representation moving forward. I brought 3 documents to that meeting. The original county plat, the new independent survey with Thomas's stamp certification, and the county GIS parcel map showing, side by side, the true boundary of my lot and the true status of the land behind Russell Kane's property. I laid them out one at a time, calmly, without raising my voice, because I had learned by then that calm, documented facts carried far more weight than anger ever could. The silence in that room was heavy. Patricia, the board member who had seemed uncomfortable from the very first meeting, finally spoke up. She admitted she had raised concerns privately when the fence project was first proposed, questioning why the board was relying on a survey nobody had actually seen, and that her concerns had been dismissed at the time. Russell tried, briefly, to argue that the parcel behind his home had been informally used by the community for years, and that his personal improvements were simply maintenance. But with the HOA's own attorney sitting right there, reviewing county records that clearly showed no HOA ownership or maintenance authority over that parcel, that argument collapsed almost immediately. Using association resources, including the construction crew that built my fence, to service land the HOA didn't legally control, while simultaneously encroaching on a homeowner's actual private property, was not a defensible position under any interpretation of the association's governing documents. Resolution. What followed over the next several weeks moved faster than I expected. The HOA's attorney, clearly unwilling to let the association absorb legal liability for one board member's decisions, recommended immediate corrective action. The board voted, with Patricia and 2 newly vocal members in favor, to remove the disputed fence and restore my property to its original, unobstructed boundary at the association's expense. The association also commissioned a full independent survey of the entire common area and every bordering lot, this time using a properly licensed and verified surveyor whose credentials were shared openly with all homeowners, to ensure nothing like this would happen again without transparency. As for Russell, the revelations from that meeting spread quickly through the neighborhood, as these things tend to do. At the next scheduled HOA election, he did not run for re-election. Whether that was his own decision or a quiet suggestion from the rest of the board, I never found out for certain, and honestly, I didn't feel the need to ask. Patricia was elected the new HOA president, and one of her first actions in office was implementing a policy requiring any proposed changes to common area boundaries to be accompanied by a licensed survey, shared publicly with affected homeowners, at least 60 days before any construction could begin. The fence came down on a warm afternoon in early summer. I watched the crew remove the last section of chain link, and once the ground was leveled and reseeded, my daughter and I planted a new swing between those same 2 oak trees, exactly where it had stood before, on land that had always, legally and rightfully, been ours. What I learned. Looking back on everything, I think about how close I came to simply accepting that letter, that fence, that violation notice, without ever pulling the original plat map or requesting an independent survey. It would have been easy to assume the HOA knew what it was doing, to assume an official-looking letter carried the weight of settled law. Most people never think to question these things, because most of the time, HOAs really are just trying to maintain shared spaces and keep a neighborhood looking tidy. But this experience taught me that ownership isn't something you should ever simply take someone else's word for, especially when it involves land you've lived on and cared for. The county recorder's office keeps records for exactly this reason. Property maps and plats exist so that when someone tries to redraw a line without authority, the truth is still sitting there, filed away, waiting for someone to go looking for it. If there's one thing I'd want anyone watching this to take away, it's this. If a fence appears where it shouldn't, if a board tells you a survey exists without ever showing it to you, don't just adjust your garden and move on. Go to your county records office. Ask for the original plat. Hire your own independent surveyor if you have to. The land you paid for, the land your name is on, deserves that much protection. In the end, the fence they built to take a piece of my property became the very thing that led to uncovering the truth about who really owned what in that neighborhood. Sometimes the thing meant to shut you out is exactly what opens the door to setting everything right. And these days, when I sit in my backyard in the evening, watching my daughter push off from that swing between the 2 oak trees, I think about how a stack of old paper in a county archive turned out to matter more than any letter an HOA ever sent me. The lines were always there. It just took someone willing to look for them. Thanks for watching this story. If you've ever dealt with an HOA overstepping its boundaries, quite literally, I'd love to hear about it. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you are subscribed, because there are plenty more where this came from.